All right, let's dive in with a thought experiment. Imagine this. What if the very beliefs you hold, the structure of how you see the world, could be used against you? Like, what if they could be exploited?
To guarantee a loss in some kind of game.
Yeah, a game you didn't even know you were playing.
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't that make you question just how rational those beliefs really are?
That's a really interesting way to frame it. It gets right at that tension between what we believe internally and how those beliefs might leave us vulnerable in the outside world. Kind of sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about.
Definitely. And welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. You know how we do things here. You give us the sources, and we take a deep dive into them, pulling out the key insights for you. And for our listeners who are really into philosophy, this one is right up your alley. We're tackling Dutch book arguments.
And our roadmap for this particular journey is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Dutch book arguments. It's an incredibly thorough and authoritative resource, really gets deep into the weeds of these arguments and what they mean.
So today's mission is basically to dissect these Dutch book arguments. DBAs for short. We want to figure out how they work, the logic behind them, see where they're strong, where they maybe fall apart, and ultimately what they tell us about philosophical ideas of rationality and how consistent our beliefs are.
And what's especially interesting, I think, from a philosophical standpoint, is how these arguments try to use something that seems really practical, like avoiding financial loss, to say something really deep about what it means to have rational beliefs.
So let's break it down, starting with the core of the basic Dutch book argument. What's the main point it's trying to make?
The basic DBA, at its heart, aims to show that if the way you think about probabilities doesn't line up with, the fundamental rules of probability, you open yourself up to what's called a Dutch book.
A Dutch book. Sounds ominous.
It kind of is. It's a set of bets, very carefully constructed, that guarantees you'll lose money overall no matter what happens. So if my internal sense of probabilities is off, someone could essentially trick me into a series of bets that seem okay at the time, but they're rigged so that no matter the outcome, I end up losing.
Exactly. And to understand how it works, we need to lay out the three basic axioms of probability. These are kind of the foundation that the DBA builds upon.
Let's hear them.
Okay, first up is non-negativity. Basically, this means the probability of any proposition, any statement, has to be greater than or equal to zero. You can't have a probability that's less than zero. I mean, even the slightest possibility that something is true already implies a probability that's at least zero.
That seems pretty intuitive. What's next?
The second one is called normalization. Now, in the context of the DBA, this typically means that the probability of a tautology, something that's true by definition, like a circle is round, has to be equal to 1. There are variations here. Sometimes you see logical truth or necessary truth instead of tautology. It's a little nuanced, but in the end, the point is that you should be absolutely certain of things that are logically guaranteed to be true. Okay, so if I'm not 100% certain about something that absolutely has to be true, that leaves me open to being exploited.
Right. And then we have finite additivity. This one says that if you have two propositions that can't both be true at the same time, they're mutually exclusive, then the probability of one or the other being true is the sum of their individual probabilities.
Like the classic coin toss. If getting heads is 0.5 probability and tails is also 0.5, then the probability of getting either heads or tails is 1. Because, those are the only two options.
Exactly. So we've got these three axioms. Now, the Dutch book theorem is what connects violating these axioms with that idea of being guaranteed to lose money. It basically states that if the odds you're willing to accept on a bet, which reflect your degree of belief in something happening, don't follow these axioms, then it's always possible for someone to cook up a set of bets using those very odds that will make you lose money no matter what.
Okay, and didn't Definetti formalize this with a specific way of thinking about bets?
Yeah, he had a really neat way of connecting bets with degrees of belief. So let's say you've got a proposition like H and a stake, which is S. Your betting quotient, which we'll call a Q, represents how strongly you believe in H. A bet on H, then, would pay out S minus QS if H is true, but cost you QS if H is false. Your betting quotient, that Q, is basically like the price you're willing to pay for the bet based on how likely you think H is to happen.
Okay, so if I believe H has a 70% chance of happening, my betting quotient would be 0.7. If I bet $10, I pay $7 for the chance to win $3 if H is true. But of course, I risk losing my $7 if it's false.
Right. That's how it works. Now, let's see how violating each of those axioms can get you into trouble. Imagine your betting quotient for H is, negative. You're basically paying someone to take a bet that pays out if H is true. A bookie could just take that bet from you, pocket your money, and then no matter what happens with H, you've already lost. Either you have to pay out later or you paid for nothing. Doesn't make much sense, does it?
Definitely not a winning strategy. What about violating normalization?
If your betting quotient for a tautology isn't 1, a bookie can use that against you. If it's more than 1, they'll sell you a bet that pays out when the tautology is true, which is always, and you end up paying more than you could possibly win. If it's less than 1, they buy the bet from you for less than the guaranteed payout. Either way, you lose. You're basically not valuing certainty the way you should.
So failing to be totally certain about something that is guaranteed to be true can cost you.
Absolutely. Now, for finite additivity, imagine you've got two propositions, we'll call them H1 and H2, and they can't both be true. If your betting quotient for H1 or H2 isn't the same as the sum of your quotients for H1 and H2 individually, that's a problem. If it's lower, a bookie can offer you bets on H1 and H2 at your higher individual rates, and then buy a bet from you on H1 or H2 at your lower combined rate. No matter which one happens, they make money. If your combined quotient is higher, they just reverse the bets and you still lose. Basically, your probabilities for these separate but related events aren't adding up the way they should.
So if I say there's a certain chance of one of two things happening, it needs to match up perfectly with the chances I give for each of those things happening individually.
Exactly. And what's really interesting, especially for a philosopher, is that this Dutch book theorem shows us that every time you violate one of those basic probability axioms, someone can create a set of bets where each bet on its own seems fair to you.
Fair in the sense that you're not expecting to lose or win money on average based on your own beliefs.
Right. But the combination of those seemingly fair bets is what leads to the guaranteed loss. So the DBA is arguing that because our beliefs should guide how we bet, going against those axioms shows a deep kind of irrationality.
Okay, so we've laid out the basic argument. If you stray from probability, you're susceptible to a Dutch book. How is this argument usually presented in more detail when philosophers dig into it?
Well, the more detailed presentations really hammer home the point that having beliefs that violate those probability axioms is irrational because it makes you vulnerable to this potential for guaranteed loss. It assumes a strong link between how strongly you believe in something and your willingness to bet based on that belief at the corresponding odds. Then the Dutch book theorem is what shows how that vulnerability actually works. And the conclusion is that to be rational, our beliefs have to be probabilistic. They have to follow those rules.
Didn't De Finetti have specific terms for those who played by the rules and those who didn't?
Yeah. He called beliefs that were susceptible to a Dutch book, those that could lead to guaranteed loss, incoherent. And beliefs that were safe from this, meaning they followed the probability axioms, he called coherent.
And thinkers like Ramsey and De Finetti saw this incoherence as a form of inconsistency.
Exactly. They argued that not following those axioms and therefore being vulnerable to a Dutch book basically means there's some kind of internal inconsistency within your beliefs. But a big question philosophers debate is whether this incoherence, as shown through these betting situations, is really the same kind of logical inconsistency we see when someone holds beliefs that directly contradict each other, like believing something is both true and false at the same time.
So, avoiding a sure loss in a bet seems pretty smart. But does that mean following the probability axioms actually guarantees that I won't face a sure loss?
Well, that's where the converse Dutch book theorem comes in. It was proven separately, and basically it says that if your betting odds do follow those probability axioms, then no combination of bets based on those odds can guarantee a loss, or guarantee a win for whoever's taking those bets from you, for that matter.
Okay, so following the rules might not guarantee a win, but at least it keeps me safe from a loss that's baked in from the start.
Exactly. It gives you that kind of protection. But we need to be careful here, for a really precise philosophical understanding. Both the Dutch book theorem and its converse depend a lot on exactly how we define those probability axioms and what we mean by bet and sure loss. For example, if normalization only applies to tautologies, you could still be tricked into a guaranteed loss by betting against a logical truth that's not technically a tautology in a narrow sense.
I see. So even if we expand it to cover all logical or necessary truths, there's still a problem. If I know something's definitely true, but I don't give it a probability of John, I could still lose for sure against someone who does know. Like, if I know all bachelors are unmarried, but I say there's only a 90% chance that John, who's a bachelor, is unmarried, someone could bet against me and know they'll win.
Precisely. Philosophers have tried to deal with this by limiting what counts as a sure loss, maybe only focusing on losses that don't rely on specific facts about the world. Or they might limit the types of bets allowed in the argument. The point is, the strength of these theorems depends on a really careful balance between how broad the axioms are and how we interpret these betting scenarios.
And what about those other probabilistic rules beyond those basic three, like conditional probability or the rule of total probability? Do those play a role?
Absolutely. That's a really important point when we're thinking about how convincing the DBA really is. You see, even if you follow those three basic axioms and you're safe from the most simple types of Dutch books, there are other ways to be tricked if you're not careful. The converse Dutch book theorem, in its usual form, really only deals with violations of those three core axioms. And there are other probabilistic rules out there that can get you in trouble if you don't follow them. Plus, our source points out that it's not always the case that someone who's being incoherent with their beliefs will actually be exploited. And even someone with coherent beliefs might get caught in a situation where a particular set of bets leads to a loss. The real question for philosophers is whether those specific vulnerabilities that Dutch books highlight really give us a strong reason to accept probabilism as a requirement for rational thought.
It seems like the whole argument rests on the assumption that our beliefs directly translate into a willingness to accept bets that line up with those beliefs. But is that always true?
Not necessarily. In real life, people might say no to a bet that seems fair based on their stated beliefs. Maybe they don't like taking risks, or the stakes are too low to bother with, like Ramsey pointed out. Or they might take a bet for reasons that have nothing to do with their beliefs. Maybe social pressure, or because it seems fun. Even if we modify the argument to say that rational agents will only take bets that are fair or in their favor, that doesn't totally solve the problem. There's still a lot to think about philosophically.
This leads to a really fundamental question for us as philosophers.
Yeah.
Can it ever actually be rational to violate those probability axioms?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The thing is, the sure loss a Dutch book promises is often more of a possibility than a certainty. A clever bookie could potentially offer reverse bets, so the person who seems incoherent actually ends up winning. Or there might be reasons to hold seemingly incoherent beliefs that have nothing to do with money.
So it might be more of a theoretical vulnerability than a practical one in many cases.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The argument then usually shifts to say that incoherence makes you systematically vulnerable to sure losses in a way that coherence doesn't. That potential for being exploited, even if it doesn't always happen, is what makes incoherence irrational. But, like philosopher Alan Hodjack has pointed out, there's kind of a flip side to this. Just as violating the axioms can create a situation where you're guaranteed to lose, it can also create situations where you're guaranteed to win.
Kind of like a reverse Dutch book.
Yeah, exactly. Some call it the checkbook argument. And that brings up the question of whether the mere possibility of a sure loss is really enough to say that any kind of incoherence is irrational.
So maybe focusing on financial loss isn't the most compelling way to think about it from a philosophical perspective. What about the idea that a Dutch book reveals a deeper logical flaw in how we believe things?
That's a really important interpretation. It suggests that the real value of the Dutch book argument isn't about avoiding losing money, but about showing a fundamental inconsistency within a set of beliefs that go against those probability axioms. Philosophers like Skerms trace this back to Ramsey, who thought that violating probability laws is kind of like violating laws about preferences. It leads to choices that just don't make sense. This view says that to have rational beliefs, you have to be probabilistically coherent, because if you're not, it's like you're contradicting yourself.
And how does that divided mind inconsistency idea from Arment fit into this logical interpretation?
Arment argued that being vulnerable to a Dutch book shows an inconsistency where you end up giving conflicting values to the exact same option or outcome. This is often clearest in cases where you violate that additivity axiom. But a problem for this view is that being incoherent in the sense of violating those probability axioms doesn't always mean you're clearly holding contradictory evaluations. Like, if you believe a complex logical truth is only 99% likely to be true, that doesn't automatically mean you're holding two opposing views about that proposition. Plus, the additivity axiom, when we think about it this way, kind of assumes that the values we give to different outcomes can be added together, which is another assumption on top of how we form beliefs in the first place.
And Ramsey connected this to our preferences, like what we want and how we choose between different things.
Yes. Ramsey's work was groundbreaking. He said that our degrees of belief, how strongly we believe in something, are basically tied to our preferences, what we want to happen. He developed this really cool mathematical framework, a representation theorem, showing that if someone's preferences follow certain axioms that seem rational, then they act as if they have degrees of belief that align with those probability axioms. So, in this view, incoherent beliefs would lead to inconsistencies in those underlying preferences. But a big worry for philosophers is whether inconsistencies in preferences are really the same kind of logical flaw as holding two directly contradictory beliefs, and whether all our beliefs actually show up in our preferences the way this argument needs them to.
This has led some to develop depragmatized Dutch book arguments, right? Trying to get away from that direct link between beliefs and preferences.
Exactly. Philosophers like Christensen, Hausen, and Urbach have been trying to show that probabilistic coherence is necessary for consistency without bringing preferences into it. For example, Hausen and Urbach propose that we think of someone's degree of belief as the betting odds they consider fair. Their argument then is that if your beliefs are incoherent, you can't consistently see those corresponding betting odds as fair. So, being incoherent is like holding a set of beliefs about fairness that are themselves inconsistent.
But there are problems with this approach too, aren't there?
There are. One big one is that someone might believe something to a certain degree without thinking the corresponding bet is fair. Maybe they don't really understand what fair means in this context, or maybe they think it's unfair for reasons other than their degree of belief. Like, again, think about betting on really complex logical truths. It might feel unfair even if you're almost certain it's true. Another issue is that this approach seems to assume we have full beliefs about what's fair, which isn't necessarily true. And that problem with the additivity axiom is still there. Even if someone thinks each individual bet is fair, the total effect of those bets can still guarantee a loss, which makes this idea of collective fairness a bit shaky. Plus, this depragmatized approach often assumes that money is a perfect way to measure value, which kind of undermines the claim that it's not based on practical considerations.
And what about Christensen's take on this?
Christensen made a slightly weaker connection. He said that incoherent beliefs sanction a set of bets as fair that can't actually be fair. He thinks this shows some kind of flaw, either in your knowledge or your logic, but the problem with the additivity axiom still hangs around. And even his later versions, where he talks about simple agents who only value money, still rely on a connection between beliefs and how we judge bets. So we're back to some degree of pragmatism. And like that tech book argument shows, even these simple agents might have rational reasons to be incoherent in certain situations. Ultimately, saying that sanctioning unfair bets is something only incoherent beliefs do, and that it's comparable to logical inconsistency, is still up for debate.
Okay, so if the purely logical interpretation has these issues, what about seeing coherence as a pragmatic kind of consistency?
That's a different way to look at it. This view says that the problem with incoherence is that if we assume there's a link between beliefs and preferences, usually through how we calculate expected value in decision theory, then incoherence makes our whole system of evaluating things self-defeating. The unfairness of a Dutch book is seen as something internal to your own beliefs and how you value things, not something imposed from the outside. The idea is that even if you refuse to bet, or somehow end up winning, the fact that your beliefs would lead you to see a set of bets as fair, or even in your favor when they actually guarantee a loss, shows a problem with how you evaluate things.
So it's not just about losing money, it's about an inconsistency in how my beliefs lead me to value things in the world.
Precisely. But this view depends on having a theory of preference and utility, which, as philosopher Alan Kaplan has pointed out, adds a lot of complexity and potential for disagreement. This interpretation also relies on the assumption that you should see a bet as fair if its expected value based on your beliefs and how much you value different outcomes is zero. This often assumes what's called negation coherence, which means your belief in something not happening should be 1 minus your belief in it happening.
And even if we accept all these assumptions, does the inconsistency revealed by a Dutch book definitely equal irrationality?
That's not totally clear, especially in cases where the incoherence comes from not fully grasping really complex, logical, or necessary truths. It's not obvious that rationality always demands that we eliminate every single inconsistency like that. Some philosophers think coherence is an ideal, but it's not the only one, and sometimes it might clash with other ideals. Our source concludes that even if we make some idealizing assumptions, the DBA does show that incoherence is a kind of flaw in how you evaluate things. But whether that always means you're being irrational overall is still an open question. The debate about whether the DBA really supports probabilism and whether it's more about consistency in our beliefs or directly about being irrational because you could be Dutch booked is still very much alive. These ideas are also being applied to other rules of probability beyond those three basic ones, though it gets even trickier to define exactly what kind of inconsistency we're dealing with.
And towards the end of our source, it mentioned the work of Pettigrew.
Yes. Pettigrew has explored the idea that if you could be Dutch booked in every possible way, across all the ways the world could be, that might show a kind of deep irrationality. But this raises more questions about what a possible world really means and how Dutch books relate to that. He also points out that philosophers are still trying to find reasons to justify these rules of probability that don't rely on betting scenarios.
This has been a really thorough exploration of Dutch book arguments.
Mm.
For our listeners, what are the key philosophical points to take away from all of this?
At their core, Dutch book arguments give us a powerful way to examine how rational and consistent our degrees of belief are. They do this by using the concrete example of betting and the possibility of losing money no matter what. The main idea is that if your beliefs go against the basic rules of probability, you become vulnerable to a set of bets that look fair on their own, but together guarantee you'll lose.
And to our philosophy-loving listeners out there, it's clear that these debates about Dutch books go far beyond money. They get at the heart of what it means to be rational and what it means for our beliefs to hang together in a consistent way. Is the threat of a Dutch book a sign of a practical problem, a logical contradiction, or something else altogether?
Exactly. Philosophers are still wrestling with whether the DBA reveals a deep inconsistency, like holding a belief and its opposite at the same time, or a more practical problem with how our beliefs connect to what we do and how we value things. There's no easy answer. And figuring out what these arguments tell us about rationality and how beliefs are structured is still a really active area of philosophical exploration.
So, given all the complexities of the Dutch book argument and all the different interpretations we've talked about, here's a final thought for you to chew on. Does that potential for a guaranteed loss, that vulnerability that a Dutch book reveals, really show a fundamental irrationality in our beliefs? Or is it maybe more like a subtle tool that highlights the complex connections and potential weaknesses in our whole web of beliefs? A web that, understandably, might not always be perfectly aligned with those probability rules for all sorts of cognitive and practical reasons.
That's a really great question to leave our listeners with. It really gets at the heart of what's at stake here. Or maybe we could also ask, what if a perfectly rational person, rational in every other way, could still be Dutch booked because of limits in how they think logically or because they don't have all the information? What would that tell us about the limits of using probabilistic coherence as the ultimate test of rationality?
Really makes you think. If you want to go even deeper into this topic, and trust me, there's a lot more to discover, we highly recommend checking out that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Dutch book arguments for yourself. And there's a ton of other work out there on Bayesian epistemology and the philosophy of belief more broadly. You might also find it interesting to look into the arguments about countable additivity, principles of how we revise our beliefs over time, and even thought experiments like the Sleeping Beauty problem. They all feed into this ongoing philosophical conversation. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.